I am Beth Carpenter. I'm the overall coordinator for program this year. Contrary to what you have read in here and a number of other places, and I also think very much to her relief, you will not be hearing a talk tonight by Bobby Trist. You will be hearing a talk by Bobby Trice. And you should have been on the program committee, as Bobby Trist was our speaker coordinator, and we had Bobby Trice as one of our speakers. It got to be really confusing at times. So anyway, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce to you tonight Bobby Trice, our speaker for this evening. Bobby is the Quaker Outreach Coordinator for FCNL. In this role, he cultivates relationships with friends and coordinates FCNL staff and volunteer engagement with Quaker communities across the country. Bobby is also deeply invested in communicating across political divides, practicing seeing that of God in people he disagrees with, and building relationships to make change within and beyond Congress. Bobby's a member of Friends Meeting of Washington, of Baltimore Yearly Meeting in Washington, D.C. He also worships with the Queer Christian Experimental Three Rivers Meeting in New England Yearly Meeting, and serves on the board of managers of Beacon Hill Friends House. Over the last year, he participated in the first Quakers Uprooting Racism cohort, a collaboration of several Quaker organizations to foster a community of practice to accelerate the movement for racial justice in the Religious Society of Friends. And in addition to being our speaker this evening, Bobby will be presenting the workshop Connecting and Communicating with Congress on Common Ground, along with Justin Hurdle, who I'm told is really the star of the workshop, not Bobby, on Friday afternoon. So try to get to that. Tonight, Bobby will bring us a message about his journey to Quakerism and share stories of building transformative relationships and working for justice among friends over the last 2 years of pandemic, crisis, and awakening. The title of his talk will be Beloved Community and the World We Seek, My Spiritual Journey to Living Quaker Faith and Practice through FCNL. Bobby will speak to us out of the silence.
Blessed are you, awakener, life of all worlds, who removes sleep from my eyes and slumber from my eyelids. Blessed are you, wings of gold, who crowns my people, all people, with splendor. Blessed are you, liberation worker, who moves us to stretch and expand towards freedom. Blessed are you, abundance, for helping me remember I have everything I need. Blessed are you, source of life, who I draw upon for strength, and who reminds me that rest is a sacred act. Blessed are you, weaver of being, who shaped the human being with wisdom, making for us all the openings and vessels of the body. It is known that we are miracles, that all bodies are miracles. Blessed are you, you of many names, for revealing infinite paths of healing. Blessed are you, you of many names, for revealing infinite paths of healing. These are a few lines from queer morning blessings I say every day. I share these words and this blessing to ground myself and ourselves tonight. Good evening again, friends. I'm Bobby Trice, not Bobby Trist. And I serve Friends as the Quaker Outreach Coordinator at FCNL, your Quaker lobby, the Friends Committee on National Legislation. It's a real joy for me to be joining you on site and online through the marvel of hybrid technology for this evening program at Illinois Yearly Meeting. I visited with you over the past 2 years virtually, dropping in by Zoom, but oh my goodness, is it such a joy to see you all in 3 dimensions at last on this beautiful campus in McNabb. Beyond my job title, I'm a convinced friend, a person of faith, a white person of European descent, a Canadian dual citizen, a young adult. Can you guess what year I was born? I'm a queer person, someone from a rural working class background, someone who speaks a second language, a survivor, a progressive, an organizer, an advocate, and a storyteller. These roles and identities are layers of context shaping who I am, how I see the world, and how I move through it. I'm going to lean into my identity as a storyteller and tell you some stories this evening about me and my spiritual journey to FCNL and Quakerism. I'm also going to tell you some stories about my experiences doing political and transformative change work among Quakers for the past few years. These are stories of relationships with individuals, organizations, communities, and with spirit. Some of these stories will be joyful. Others may be hard to hear. But these are my stories, my truth. And I invite you to listen with that knowledge, those ears, to listen in tongues for a resonance in what I have to share tonight. And if you find yourself leaning away or shutting out what you hear, I invite you to lean in closer, to be curious, to ask questions, to wonder with me, to work against the learned impulse we have to separate ourselves from one another. The arc of my soul is shaped like a spiral. I've cycled and swirled around FCNL, Quakerism, politics, liberation, and spirit's leadings to my pieces of work to bring about beloved community and the world we seek. A vision for a community where our differences are affirmed rather than eradicated, and a world built on peace, justice, equity, and an earth restored. My hope is to touch on the mysticism and the mutually transformative relationships that led me here this evening. I'll lead you through several seasons of my life, touching on a few crucible moments in my spiritual autobiography, weaving through highlights of these last 2 years of pandemic, all the way up to my speaking with you tonight. This is my faith story, my FCNL story, my Quakerism story. For 2 years, I was on the edge of the FCNL community and the Religious Society of Friends. Answering the call from Spirit, I now work for the organization, and I'm a practicing Quaker. It's my story about becoming a friend and an advocate. It's a piece of our shared story about becoming the Society of Friends together again and again as we rewild, remix, and reclaim this tradition for our times as co-authors with Spirit. And it's all one small thread in our larger societal story of Friends' prophetic and powerful role to play in transforming ourselves, building relationships grounded on spiritual truths, and witnessing for policy change and that beloved community. Please just share a few more moments of grounding with me as we invite Spirit in to share this evening with us. I wasn't raised Quaker. I grew up in an intentional community in Northern California, running barefoot in fields and meadows. It made sense to me later that my favorite kickball field was immediately adjacent to the Grass Valley Friends Meeting House. I was quite literally Quaker adjacent my entire life. My Quakerism story is my FCNL story. And my FCNL story starts with a Quaker named Jamie DeMarco in the small town of Swannanoa, North Carolina. In 2015, I was a precocious atheist high schooler getting ready to jump ship to a new adventure. And Jamie hosted me for an overnight visit at what became my alma mater, Warren Wilson College. A liberal arts school with a bent towards social justice and civic engagement, Warren Wilson was my first choice school. It's a work college that teaches its students to value all forms of labor towards the common good. Something fell into place during that visit. A matter-of-fact clearness that I would end up at Warren Wilson. Not that I should, or wanted to, or was scared to, just that I would. And that might have been my first memorable experience of clearness and way opening. During that visit, Jamie first told me about FCNL and Quaker advocacy, setting me on the journey that brought me here today. Through the power of relationship, way did open. I attended Warren Wilson that fall, but didn't think about FCNL and Quakerism again for 2 years. As a college sophomore, I went on a spring DC career trip to tour grad schools, Congress, nonprofits, and build a network for after graduation. During that trip, I ended up in FCNL's third floor conference room, learning more about Quaker advocacy from, you guessed it, Jamie DeMarco, who had accepted a program assistant position at FCNL. And standing in the lobby of FCNL's building, on our way out to the next stop, I felt another mystical moment of something falling into place. As a stone in a creek rolls into just the right spot to conduct the babble of the brook into song, so rolled into place my sense that I would be here, across from the Senate, working as part of a faithful foothold against the status quo and dominant political culture someday. But for now, back to my textbooks and projects in the Blue Ridge. That fall, another relationship and mystical experience nudged me along my path. Michelle Beers was a peer group leader and mentor during my early undergraduate years, and like Jamie, she accepted a fellowship at FCNL after graduation. She came back to campus to organize and recruit students for FCNL's Spring Lobby Weekend Conference. She trained me to lobby for just migration policy and a roadmap to citizenship. She called me a day or two later and said, you know, Bobby, I think you can do this. I've seen your drive and creativity. I think we can get a group of Wilson students up to DC. Will you work with me on this? I felt scared and unsettled, yet also seen, and resolved that I was being called into something I was supposed to do. That might have been my first experience of someone naming spiritual gifts I steward. Michelle empowered me to grow into my leadership as an organizer. Her encouragement was important, and it kind of changed my life. Even then, I knew I wanted to do for others what she had done for me. I wanted to amplify that still, small voice that moved me out of frustration into meaningful action. That spring, I brought 10 of my friends to Washington and joined over 400 other young advocates from across the country. And together, we learned about immigration reform and lobbied our members of Congress. I was so refreshed by FCNL's approach to lobbying in the manner of friends. After years of cynical, precocious atheism, I started trying to see that of God in each person, including in the members with whom I disagreed. And we had data to show our strategy was working. Speaking truth to power through storytelling was changing hearts and minds in Congress. The passion of my young adult peers was contagious. The expertise of speakers made the policy details accessible. The undercurrent of the spirit among us of Quaker values and intentions realized grounded me. We were not all friends, but we were unified by a thirst to realize the world we see. Simply sharing witness with other impassioned young people transformed the course of my spiritual and vocational formation. Organizing a group of students, planning, fundraising, and leading the trip showed me I could get things done. But more importantly, I learned I liked it, I was good at it, and I was living out my values to affect change. I would later come to know this experience as stewarding spiritual gifts and being well led by spirit. As an anthropology and social work student, I was convinced of each person's inherent capacity for change, dignity and worth, and right to self-determination. And my social work mentor always liked to point out, society is just people, right? It's a little disingenuous for us to believe that people can change, but society can't. Little did I know how close to Quakerism my values and my practice were leading. The following year, I joined the Advocacy Corps, one of the FCNL young adult programs that trains young people to organize their community around a year-long policy campaign. I spent 10 months as one of 20 young adult organizers across the country lobbying on police militarization. The Advocacy Corps brought me lasting friendships with other young changemakers and brought me closer to FCNL and the Religious Society. During my Advocacy Corps year, I fell deeper in love with my work. I enjoyed being an expert on an issue. Over time, I started thinking strategically about how to apply pressure in different ways to make legislative change happen. My peers and my communities helped me learn how to communicate the urgency of policy change and the tools available to us. I learned how to empower myself and others through knowledge, skills, and collective action in pursuit of the common good. Like my social policy textbooks, my values and nascent faith were coming to life before my eyes. I was learning how building relationships with one another and power brokers is how we get heard. I built relationships with staff in North Carolina legislators' offices. Relationships that started out on rocky footing. But by following FCNL's approach to lobbying, seeking common ground, and connecting with the divine in each staffer, I built productive relationships with those offices over the year. The first time I lobbied a North Carolina office on police reform, the staffer happened to be an ex-law enforcement officer. Lucky me. We got into a heated argument and he nearly shouted me out of the office. It was really contentious. I hadn't quite picked up FCNL's approach yet. But 3 monthly conference calls later, we had established a positive rapport. And during FCNL's annual meeting, I walked into his office to lobby on SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, formerly food stamps. The same staffer smiled warmly. He gave me a strong handshake, looked me right in the eye and said, "Hey, Bobby, thanks for coming all the way up to DC. It's good to see you. I'm excited to tell you we're going to support your ask on SNAP. I figured you'd like to hear some good news for a change." We laughed together and made plans for another meeting on police reform. For me, this was one of the early experiences that demonstrated the transformative nature of FCNL's work, changing entrenched systems through faith, dialogue, and person-to-person connection. And this is just one of many, many stories I could tell. Alongside my work as an organizer, I embarked on a journey of faith formation, born out of Spirit's call to action. After my first spring lobby weekend, I felt nourished by the legacy of Friends' advocacy for peace and justice and sensed a leading to join that history. I came even closer to Quakerism through my work in the Advocacy Corps. I went to Swannanoa Valley Friends meeting for worship to connect about FCNL's advocacy, and then I never left. Like many convinced friends, my advocacy brought me in contact with the Religious Society, and I decided to stay. That first visit to Swannanoa Valley Friends was in the winter, a time of fallow darkness carrying the promise of new light and life. And my moment of convincement mirrored that contrast. As a college student, I had been searching for ways to let my life speak through meaningful action, but facing everyday news of a splintered society and a world ablaze, I arrived at a moment of despair and helplessness. Like early friends, I found truth in deep listening and worship. Halfway through my first meeting for worship, I started to weep. Like early friend Margaret Fell, I was broken open by revelation, filled with fierce love and hope for an earth restored and a society made whole. I was held and comforted and renewed by my newfound Quaker community. For the first time, I had a spiritual home somewhere. Although I never imagined I would be a religious person, I found myself waking up every first day to sit in expectant waiting worship. Swannanoa Valley Friends Meeting welcomed me with open arms. I was blessed with the mentorship of elders at my meeting, like Beth and Mel Kaiser, who animated Quaker values with their contributions to our community and society at large. By the time Spring Lobby weekend rolled around again in 2019, I was fully convinced of the power of Quaker advocacy. I was deepening my own faith and practice with Swannanoa Valley Friends. I was making progress teaching the wider Buncombe County community about police militarization and how we could challenge it. I had found a calling and followed it by applying to FCNL's fellowship program, like Jamie, Michelle before me. At Spring Lobby weekend that year, we were gathered to lobby on immigration once again. The urgent need to stop government overspending on heinous immigration enforcement practices was palpable. This time I saw us come back. I saw new people join us. I saw the strength of our shared hope and efforts cast light into the murkiness of the future. Everything was not okay, but we were still working together towards a common vision of how we wanted the world to look, and that was powerful. Spring Lobby weekend left as quickly as it arrived. I graduated from college that May and took a job as the program assistant for Quaker outreach at FCNL. In that role, I trained hundreds of college students and Quakers to lobby Congress for a better world. I traveled around the country to engage Quakers and recruit for FCNL's young adult programs. My fellowship brought me new skills, a sharpened organizing toolkit, and deepened practice. I learned more about Quakerism, myself, and how my faith and hope for the world can manifest as meaningful action. I felt connected to Friends Meeting of Washington, to FCNL staff, and my cohort of program assistant peers. I fell head over heels in love with my work in Washington, DC. In November of 2019, it was my turn to give a speech at FCNL's annual meeting. And as I was preparing, I thought about the people I watched do this before me, Jamie, Michelle, and the life-changing impact of those relationships. I thought a lot about lineage and rites of passage and tradition in the FCNL community. I thought about how we construct our own folkways related to Quakerism, yet not of it. I thought about how FCNL acts as a bridge between Quakerism and the wider Quaker world. In that speech, I told a version of this story that I believe even more today. FCNL convinced me and continues to convince me every day. FCNL helped me find my faith and place in the religious society of friends. FCNL helped me believe I could make a difference. I came full circle with the words I spoke in that speech. I became the person, Jamie, Michelle, I once aspired to be. My favorite poem, To Be of Use by Marge Piercy, closes with the lines, "The pitcher cries for water to carry, and a person for work that is real." At FCNL, I have found my water, the real work I have been crying for, the work Spirit has led me to. Like that of God, our real work is at once within us and beyond us. Only in and through community do we come to know. To Spirit, to FCNL, and Quakers nationwide, thank you for being that community for me. Thank you for helping me be of use. None of us could have foreseen the cascading moments of crisis and opportunity yet to come that would challenge and call me, friends, FCNL, all of us into ever deeper transformative service and witness. That spring and summer, the COVID-19 pandemic upended everything we thought we knew. One day, FCNL staff were working in the office, walking across the street to lobby the Senate, traveling around the country, visiting Quakers in their homes, and the next, everyone was at home. in front of computer screens, lobbying and meeting and visiting on Zoom. We held the first all-virtual Spring Lobby weekend focused on the climate crisis. Friends communities felt deep disruption and deep faithfulness in trying to maintain and nourish community online at a distance. Minneapolis police officers murdered George Floyd, another Black life extinguished in a pattern of white supremacist violence, giving rise to a nationwide uprising, awakening, reckoning, and movement. Grounded in a clear sense of purpose, I discerned a leading to participate in the protests in DC. For weeks that summer, I lobbied and organized online by day and by night, biked to the White House to show up as a Quaker called to use all tools available to bring forth the liberation we yearn for, that Spirit calls us to. We faced extreme opposition in the streets. It wasn't a question of if, but rather when and how bad the state violence we experienced would be. Metropolitan Police, unmarked federal forces, and more hit us with everything they had. Tear gas, rubber bullets, sonic crowd control, flashbangs to disperse and undermine the cry for justice. That summer, FCNL re-emphasized commitments to racial equity, not only in our policy work and organizing, but also in the internal workings of our organization. Following plans laid earlier, we began work with a faith-based racial equity consultant to assess and change our organizational culture, both with staff and our governor's general committee. Our goal was to deepen and grow as an equitable and justice-oriented Quaker organization so we might do justice more justly. We conducted an organizational assessment on racial equity and implemented interventions to work towards the needed changes identified. We formed staff and governance groups to hold and steward this organizational anti-oppression work. Regularly gathering in racial affinity groups became a normalized practice for staff that continues to this day. Working with the consultant, we put in place systems to build community capacity. We developed practices of holding one another mutually accountable to integrity with our stated beliefs, in the ways we interact with one another, whose voices get heard, and other power dynamics in our community gathering and business process during FCNL's annual meeting later that fall. I saw parallel ripples of yearning for change in the wider Quaker world, coinciding with a scramble to reconfigure communities and virtual gatherings. Before 2020, I had never attended a yearly meeting. I was a new Quaker. Throughout that summer, I visited 15 virtual annual sessions on Zoom. On top of concerns about the faithful use of technology and listening for God online, friends across many yearly meetings labored with their personal and corporate complicities in white supremacy. Communities searched for unity in what to say and how to act. Sierra Cascades yearly meeting approved a Minute for Black Lives that summer, as did many other Quaker communities. At FCNL, we collected these statements, gathering up the different expressions of friends' commitment to uprooting racism. I saw once again the power of corporate discernment and declaration. Columbia Friends meeting in South Carolina issued a minute on racist police violence and worked with me to lobby Senator Tim Scott for meaningful police reform. Durham Friends meeting in North Carolina approved a minute of solidarity, shared it with congressional offices, and then Senator Tom Tillis's staff actually reached out to them requesting a meeting to discuss their faith perspectives on the need for police reform. Quakers may be a small religious group with a reputation for being quiet, but our voices are large, friends, and we have an outsized role to play in changing public policy. This is the power of faithfulness, of prophecy. Amid great faithfulness in forging new ways forward through pandemic and towards racial justice, I also witnessed patterns of pain, dysfunction, and oppression in many gatherings and meetings for business. I saw themes that young adult friends Kai Quirk and Alison Kierkegaard would later write about that winter in their Friends Journal article, A Witness to Tethers and Transformations. Unwieldy organizational structures that take more life than they give, instances of seeking unity as one clear singular conclusion, often grounded in assumptions of the dominant culture rather than a true openness to the divine and continuing revelation in all voices. Prioritization of the status quo and comfort over prophetic transformation and leaps of faith towards liberation, and continued exclusion, othering, and harmful interactions between older and younger friends, white friends, and friends of color. I'll admit, friends, I was disheartened. Rather than a leap of faith, I experienced a fall of faith, a season of doubt in my newfound tradition and community, a dark night of the soul even. Was Quakerism any different than the rest of the dominant culture? Did I belong here? Could I stay among friends? That summer gave way to a fall of and into darker times. The pandemic surged. Energy ebbed from the movement for racial justice. The crisis of democracy deepened as the 2020 presidential election loomed large and election violence broke out regularly in DC, culminating in the January 6th insurrection. That November, during FCNL's virtual annual meeting over Zoom, we literally heard chanting, shouting, protesters clashing in the streets outside the FCNL offices where our clerks were gathered to conduct the business of the body. Though we had some community accountability systems in place for that gathering, I was anxious, on edge, anticipating the possibility that we might continue to cause harm to one another. Would those systems be enough to hold a container for our community and strive for beloved experiences of belonging? Would we even have a government tomorrow? Against this unthinkable backdrop, my sense of despair and hopelessness about Quakerism and politics came to the fore. I thought I was ready to leave FCNL. I thought I was ready to leave friends. Until I heard friend Trice bring the message in worship at annual meeting. Her ministry of friends, racial justice, policing, and a biblical economy of care spoke to my condition, my experiences over the summer, my own wrestling with faithfulness and oppression among friends. She spoke about protests, about systemic racism and state violence, about internalized white supremacy and patterns of harm in Quakerism, about the beautiful possibility of a new paradigm, an economy of care against empire, as prophesied in the scriptures and witness of early friends. I felt God walloping me awake through her words. Settling into deep worship after Sharice's message, Spirit came to me. Spirit was clear. I wasn't to leave friends. I was to stay. I was to grow and deepen. I was to know and live into the realization that these issues of power and oppression plague every community, that I could not excise my Quakerness from the wholeness of myself any more than I could my queerness or my whiteness or any other identity I inhabit. Would anywhere else be any different? Would I even feel anywhere near the depth of belonging I feel so often among friends? No. Spirit was clear. I was to apply for membership at Friends Meeting of Washington. I was to double down and apprentice to the tradition rather than to flee. Spirit was clear. You are a Quaker. Some of this work in and beyond the tradition is yours to do, and you are among your people. You are where you are supposed to be. You have ministry ahead of you yet. Trust that. Trust me. Have faith. I come back to this experience when I feel despairing about Congress and the slow pace of change too. Have faith. You are where you are supposed to be. Beautiful things unfolded from that turning point. That night, I finally sat down and wrote my Quaker membership letter. I committed to becoming a friend, ever more deeply in tune and aligned with that life and power that takes away the occasion for war, ever more deeply listening for Spirit's call. I spent that season of Advent in deep monastic study, of scholarly Quaker texts and original writings of early friends, seeking to remember and to call forth the roots of Quaker advocacy. That study gave way to listening a prepared message into being, following an invitation and call to preach ministry at a friend's church for the very first time. In the new year, renewed and resolved, I embarked on new Zoom travels in the ministry for FCNL, visiting a different worshiping community nearly every Sunday. From Florida to Maine to North Carolina to Oklahoma, I logged on to worship with friends and offer a ministry of presence, encouragement, and invitation. I preached a message at Whittier Friends Church in California, a piece of ministry that changed me as much as I co-created it, listening to Spirit and hearing that message into wholeness in worship. It was another milestone in my calling to apprentice to the Quaker tradition. As I opened myself to the promptings of Spirit, I heard Matthew's words clear as day, scripture speaking both to my own nervousness in bringing a message for the first time and to my experience of Quaker advocacy. See, I am sending you out like sheep into the midst of wolves. So be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Do not worry about how you are to speak or what you are to say, for what you are to say will be given to you at that time. For it is not you who speak, but the Spirit speaking through you. Following the thread Spirit offered me, I called that message wise as serpents, innocent as doves, focusing on that passage, Matthew 10:16 through 20. Noting that Quakers have worked to influence the government almost as long as there have been friends, I queried, what touchstones, teachings, and traditions can Quakers draw on to nourish and guide our outward lives and activism? I spoke out of the silence about the creative tensions running through scripture and theology, grounding Quaker lobbying, about early Friends' efforts to influence government, and Friends' continued lobbying tradition today. Carrying this message after a crisis of faith and season of regrounding brought me closer than ever to my Quaker faith. I felt a living stream and lineage of Quaker advocate forebears walking behind me and a line extending out in front of me. The torch is mine to carry for a time with the leadings and gifts Spirit grants me, and then it won't be. I'll pass it on eventually. As the Jewish Mishnah teaches, it is not up to you to finish the task, but neither are you free to desist from it. Embracing that perspective strengthens my faith that the cause will continue and that playing my part in the long game makes a difference. That spring was a season of discernment and clearness. I was approved and welcomed as a member of Friends Meeting of Washington, a card-carrying Quaker at last. I accepted my current position at FCNL, working alongside my companion in ministry, Alicia McBride. My place and work in this Quaker lineage were feeling ever clearer and ever more well-led. Out of worship, I felt a new leading welling up in me over the deeply divided political state of the country. Grounding in Quaker lineage was spiritually nourishing, but that history doesn't match our political context perfectly. I was led to learn as much as I could about political conflicts and ways to communicate through disagreements in Congress and in our communities. Long interested in conflict resolution and nonviolent communication, I found that Friends had several methods for this kind of relational work across difference, though I didn't often see it practiced in my experiences of Quakerism and Quaker community. I had learned about nonviolent communication from Val Livehook during an online workshop with South Central Yearly Meeting earlier that September. I started researching Quaker Bonnie Tinker, whose ministry created the Lara method, listen, ask, respond, add, to facilitate conversations about queer civil rights. Eventually, I came across Karen Tibble's faithful work in this area. I'm so looking forward to hearing her message later in these sessions as a friend at the cutting edge of faith, politics, and polarization. The fact we are both speakers on this program feels like yet another example of way opening and the spirit moving with us toward deeper understanding. Karen's research and work on seeing that of God in people we dislike or disagree with resonated deeply with the challenges I was feeling in FCNL's work. We were all still reeling from the 2020 election, the January 6th insurrection, and worsening polarization. I dove into her work and the work of scholars she cites on psychology, communications, moral foundations, and ways this research informs techniques aligned with Quaker faith and practice. I developed a workshop explicitly applying her approach and tools to my experiences lobbying Congress called Friends in Unlikely Places, Engaging with Those Who Don't Agree. Following this leading reminded me how valuable and relevant many of the spiritual traditions and technologies of Quakerism are for our times, for FCNL's work. Researching and teaching these ideas about nonviolent persuasive communication similarly deepened my sense of being tapped into a continuous stream of living witness. I could almost see Margaret Bell and other early friends penning their pamphlets and requests of the King and Parliament, seeking not to coerce, but to persuade. I felt comforted and nourished, knowing I was doing what some Quakers have always done and will always do, while simultaneously finding new tactics to harness in that same manner of friends. Deeply moved and inspired by Karen's ministry, I offered this workshop many times last year. First, for Spring Lobby Weekend participants, then for friends in yearly meetings, monthly meetings, friends churches, for advocacy corps organizers, for advocacy teams communicators, and other civic engagement and advocacy organizations. Folks told me they saw and felt the same promise in these ideas that I did. Concurrently, FCNL summer was defined by relentless advocacy to end endless war and ensure a just economic recovery from the pandemic. Our staff and advocacy teams worked around the clock to push the repeal of the 2002 Iraq authorization for the use of military force closer to the finish line than it has ever been. We secured new co-sponsors, new advocacy partners, and got the bill passed out of committee with unprecedented support. We were also balancing negotiations on infrastructure and economic recovery legislation, with special attention to extending key low-income tax credit expansions. Expansions that we successfully lobbied for in the American Rescue Plan that had the potential to slash child poverty rates and promote a community where everyone's potential might be fulfilled. And we continue that work on the child tax credit to this day. FCNL's internal anti-racism work continued, driven by those staff and governance structures taking on lives of their own and living into ownership of this ongoing work. I saw staff increasingly prioritize equity in decision-making, ranging from the vendors we choose to the way we communicate to the policies we advocate. The way I saw Quaker grounding hold a beautiful tension between work to bridge deep political divides, effectively change public policy, and promote equity in our organization and community took my breath away, even when it was messy and painful. And it is messy and painful often. Holding tensions like these and seeking transformation sometimes requires breaking things down to reshape them. It's like re-breaking a bone that has healed out of alignment in order to reset it and bring about true healing. Mirroring what I witnessed at FCNL, I saw friends in yearly meetings take action on FCNL's peace and economic justice concerns alongside their work on white supremacy, racism, and patterns of power in their communities. For many yearly meetings, anti-racism and equity were again topics that illuminated challenges and differences in those communities. However, I also observed several systems for attending to process and addressing microaggressions and other forms of harm during sessions. There are several methods, but noticing patterns of oppression and faithfulness from New England yearly meeting and stepping stones to sacred space from Pacific yearly meetings stand out. In noticing patterns, Designated noticers paid special attention to the unspoken power dynamics they witnessed in their sessions, compiled notes describing these dynamics, and reported their insights to the full body. Simultaneously, members of the community were empowered to publicly name microaggressions or other forms of power and oppression, pause business as usual, and address what happened as a community. I've seen FGC and other organizations use this as well. In Stepping Stones to Sacred Space, friends were empowered to use oops, ouch, and whoa to name harm caused in the moment. Oops meant that an actor was acknowledging harm they caused. Ouch meant a receiver was naming that they had experienced harm. And whoa meant a bystander was observing a harmful interaction taking place. These keywords gave permission to interrupt what was happening, pause, and name and unpack what had happened. That system parallels what we use at FCNL, at our annual meeting. After experiencing the dual focus on changing larger structures and friends-owned communities, both at FCNL and the wider Quaker world, I felt a familiar tugging feeling, this time in two directions. First, toward deepening my knowledge and practice of Quaker anti-racism, and second, toward reclaiming the Quaker tradition of traveling ministry as part of FCNL's work to weave connections between friends and build a thriving, faithful network of advocates. I've heard the Quaker phrase, mind the light and way will open several times in my journey. And with faith and discernment, way so often opens. Last fall, Way Opening allowed me to devote significant time to relaunch a Visiting Friends volunteer program for FCNL. Simultaneously, I received an invitation to apply to Quakers Uprooting Racism, a collaboration of several Quaker organizations to cultivate a community of practice, learning, and action focused on transforming patterns and structures of systemic racism in the Religious Society of Friends. Like other leadings, Warren Wilson, FCNL, Quakerism, calls to share ministry in worship, and at Whittier, these two things fell clearly into place. I began work on Visiting Friends 2.0, a volunteer program of Quakers who have been called to action by their faith or connection to Quakerism and have found life, power, and community with FCNL in answering that leading. During my study and experiences of the tradition, I learned that Quakers have a centuries-long history of intervisitation, seeking truth, fellowship, and deepened ties with friends by way of personal, human-to-human connection. Rooted in this practice, FCNL Visiting Friends travel in the ministry to bring messages and presentations about the core components of FCNL's work through personal stories that nurture and energize friends. Like early friends and those who travel in the ministry today, Visiting Friends visit, share, listen, and invite friends to take spirit-led action. Now, with a group of friends visiting communities virtually and in person since the beginning of the new year, the ministry of the program has taken on a life of its own. I'm so grateful for the incredible volunteers I get to work with. Friends carrying the stories of their personal spiritual journeys and living faith in action, exchanging encouragement, inspiration, and energy with the Quaker communities they visit. Seeing the joy of these relationship threads between me and volunteers, volunteers and one another, volunteers and the communities they visit, and those communities in FCNL renewed me. I can't help but see it as a kind of mystical weaving of relationships into that tapestry of friends community. It's a beautiful thing to follow a leading and feel a flow of energy for the work coming through. I felt that same flow as I was applying to the year-long Quakers Uprooting Racism program, which I just completed last week. Supported by seasoned facilitators, friends Lisa Graustein and Neonu Span, our cohort of white friends and friends of color, holding a variety of other identities and positions in Quaker communities, gathered monthly for trainings, for small worship groups, and for 3 retreats through the course of the year. Together, we cultivated skills to see and disrupt racism within our Quaker communities and beyond. Quaker practices for strength, grounding, and courage, and spiritual relationships grounded in solidarity and shared vision to sustain us in the long haul work of uprooting racism. A loving and deeply faithful network of Quaker change agents is emerging and planning to continue accompanying one another and witnessing for racial justice. I have hope, energy, and a sense of alignment with my experience of Quaker faith that I've only ever felt as strongly in my spiritual journey, organizing, and ministry with FCNL. Could the two be connected? Uprooting racism to build beloved community and changing policy to bring about the world we seek? Could they come from the same place? Different manifestations of the same impulse to listen for how God is moving us to stretch and expand towards freedom? Could Spirit be calling us to focus on transforming our communities and tradition just as much as we seek to transform the larger structures and policies to bring about the world we seek? Fairness was coming, and fast. The new year brought new calls to Quaker service and community. I accepted a nomination to serve on the board of managers of the Beacon Hill Friends House, a Quaker center for learning, action, and community in Boston, where I have continued to grow and deepen as a Quaker governor. I also deepened my online participation with Three Rivers Meeting, a new queer Christian Quaker experience of worship and community, reclaiming and reinventing Quaker practice for current times so that all can feel welcomed into deepening faithfulness. I am so grateful for the way I feel my disparate threads of identity woven together when I'm with Three Rivers. I am so grateful they offered to hold me in the light and pray for my faithfulness as I speak to you. The new year also brought new leadership to FCNL. With huge gratitude to Diane Randall, who served faithfully as the General Secretary for a decade, we welcomed Bridget Moyes as FCNL's 5th General Secretary in January. In accepting this call, Bridget came back to an organization she has come to know well as an alumna of the Young Adult Program, a former peace-building lobbyist on staff, and the clerk of our General Committee. She brought with her a vision in answer to the queries rising in me. In the past 6 months, she has worked to reorganize FCNL, to think creatively and boldly about our role in healing divides in our country and strengthening our democracy, to listen to those most affected by policies FCNL advocates, both within and beyond our community, and to live more fully into our Quaker values by embracing a more equitable and anti-racist future for FCNL. From Quakers uprooting racism to FCNL's next phase, I felt and feel the power of sharing a vision for transformation. Against the backdrop of a shared journey toward integrity, equity, and justice among friends, I am starting to see with greater clarity and certainty the exciting possibilities for FCNL's next chapter of work, for its evolving role in and beyond the Quaker world, and my role in bringing those possibilities into it. I know I'm not alone in holding that vision. I can feel my coworkers, my Quaker colleagues, and friends far and wide holding it for us, holding it for their own communities, for our society of friends. It's like part of my experience of being in worship, a kind of trust and simple knowing that others are striving to do something, to listen, to deepen, to practice humility, to discern, to follow spirit, to work for a liberated self, a liberated Quakerism, a country with liberated policies. I feel it here among you, friends. I feel a growing sense of Spirit's call to us in this present moment to answer this vision of transformation for ourselves and our pieces of work in the world. The list of current events and challenges facing us seems vast and insurmountable. Climate change, COVID, ongoing polarization and democratic crisis, systemic racism and white supremacist violence, war in Ukraine, Yemen, and around the world, continued attacks on rights and personhood of people with uteruses, queer and trans people, seemingly constant and endless gun violence from Buffalo to Uvalde to Tulsa, and more happening every day we don't hear about on the news. These mounting, interlocking injustices make following the call to action and transformation ever more important to all. Reflecting on my story, 3 common threads rise in me. The importance of Quaker faith and the practice of openness. Throughout my story, I've struggled with and deepened my Quaker faith and commitment to listening for the divine. Time and time again, staying open to mystical experience and apprenticing to the tradition, both intellectually and experientially, has grounded me in the words and actions of this Quaker lineage. It has helped me overcome doubts about my place among friends, my place seeking to influence the US government. From growing up Quaker adjacent to my latest leadings to traveling ministry and Quaker anti-racism work, listening for, testing, and following where Spirit is leading me has sustained and nourished me in my work. Where are you led, friends? How are we led, friends? The power of transformative relationships in building movements and moving forwards. I've named many of the relationships foundational to my most significant spiritual and political experiences, from those first invitations to FCNL from Jamie and Michelle to my friendships with other Spring Lobby weekend attendees and advocacy corps organizers, from staffers in North Carolina offices who couldn't disagree with me more at first, to all the dear Quaker friends from other branches in Quakerism I've met along the way. From FCNL staff and governors, Alicia, visiting friends, to new friends at Beacon Hill Friends House, Three Rivers Meeting and Quakers Uprooting Racism, and so many more, too numerous to name. These relationships, in unities and across separations, have been mutually transformative, teaching me new things about myself, my tradition, my world, just as I have offered new ways of thinking about faith and policy to those I encounter. What relationships have changed you, friends? How have you brought change through relationship? I am more convinced than ever that building beloved community where our differences are affirmed rather than eradicated is an essential piece of the world FCNL seeks to bring about. I've experienced FCNL's approach to advocacy as a spiritual practice of seeking truth and common ground that has better equipped me for the work of building beloved community. There's a beautiful interplay between the world we seek and beloved community. I've seen it in Quakers Uprooting Racism, in Three Rivers Meeting, in the wider Quaker world seeking to transform our communities and witness for systems change, and at FCNL in our anti-racism work in policy and practice. I feel us moving. I envision an FCNL and a Quakerism that is a holy nexus of prophetic witness and transformation Spirit is calling us into. I feel us moving. A tradition and organization that explicitly links anti-racism, changing public policy, and transformation in Quakerism with the liberating vision of the world we seek. I feel us moving. An FCNL that is grounded in a reinvented, reclaimed Quaker faith and practice that centers continuing revelation, listening, and the sacred in each person. I feel us moving. A Quakerism that welcomes seekers and advocates of all identities to deepen sustaining practices and make big policy change grounded in community. I feel us moving. During a Quakers Uprooting Racism retreat at Pendle Hill in April, our opening worship centered on 4 queries. What in our faith is liberatory? What in our faith represents beloved community? I carry those queries with me to recenter on God's call to bring about whatever transformations are necessary, to greet each person's precious spark of divinity, to honor and affirm differences, cultural contexts, particular gifts. I feel us moving, slowly but faithfully, like FCNL with Congress, like many intentional social. There is no end point, but we are moving and manifesting changes in policy and Quaker practice, co-authoring our tradition and our world anew, and we must continue the work, and we need you. You are among your people. You have important work before you yet. Trust that, trust me, have faith. I've shared my story, what it's taken for me to be here with you this evening. And now we have an opportunity to continue co-authoring this journey as the Religious Society of Friends. As we go through the rest of the week together, I invite you to consider these Quakers uprooting racism queries. What has it taken for you to be here? What in our faith is liberatory? What in our faith represents the beloved community? Thank you, friends. Thank you for seeking liberation and beloved community and co-authoring this evening. Many of you here today are donors to FCNL. Thank you. Some of you give every year or even every month. You are supporting our work today. Many of you here today are advocates with FCNL. Thank you. Thank you for supporting FCNL and being a part of this community and living stream of witness for peace, justice, and an earth restored. Go forth, be well, know you are loved and belong, and ever faithfully onward we go together toward beloved community and the world we see. Thank you, friends.